Honourable co-chairs Alvarez, Katak and Boudrou, and of course my good friend Victor Sebek, ladies and gentlemen. This tricontinental South-South intercultural interfaith dialogue on decarbonisation for survival is both pertinent and timeless for the African continent. Pertinent because for far too long Africa has been seen as the continent struggling for survival, the dark continent, if you wish. And timeless because at last Africa rising has become the new narrative for the last great frontier of growth. I therefore thank you for inviting me to present some remarks for your consideration, not on behalf of Africa, but as an African deeply concerned for the future and the well-being of my continent and particularly of my fellow Africans. Allow me to also express my solidarity and sympathy with the people of Paris for the attacks they have endured. We, your friends, hope and pray for your recovery and for your safety now and in the future. Decarbonisation for survival is a challenging aim for Africa. The continent of the young, newly emerging as a continent of hope for its people and its future. In this light, I would propose to you that engaging Africa as a partner in this struggle will have to address the aspirations of its people, the development of its society, and above all, engender trust. The objectives of climate change action, particularly decarbonisation, is about the future, but too often the conversation is about the past. After all, Africa is hardly the leading contributor to the world's carbon footprint, but is merely at the rising wave of growth and development. Where we are is not of Africa's making, and while Africa is rising, it has hardly risen yet. Carbon may indeed be the enemy to the industrialized world, but poverty is still the enemy of Africa. And keep in mind, it's about people, it's the enemy of most Africans. According to the latest World Bank Africa Poverty Report, Poverty in a Rising Africa, the number of people living in extreme poverty has grown substantially since 1990, even though poverty overall has declined somewhat. According to the latest World Bank estimates, the share of Africans who are poor fell from 56% in 1990 to 43% in 2012. That's good news. Thanks to population growth, however, many more people are poor, still poor, and remain in need of upliftment. The report says that the most optimistic scenario shows about 330 million African poor in 2012, up from about 280 million in 1990. This despite the fact that 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world last year were African. Africa is, however, growing off a low base and needs to educate, employ, house and care for millions of its poor still. Yet, according to a newly released study by British charity Oxfam, the richest 10% of people produce half of Earth's climate-harming fossil fuel emissions, while the poorest half contribute a mere 10%. In its report, Oxfam said that an average person among the richest 1% emits 175 times more carbon than his or her counterpart among the bottom 10%. Let us now consider the leading actor in Africa's decarbonisation play: young people. The BBC reported last year that Africa has more people aged under 20 than anywhere in the world, and the continent's population is set to double to 2 billion by 2050. Sub-Saharan Africa is the region where people aged between 15 and 29 will continue to constitute about half the population of most countries for the next 3 to 5 decades. Currently, as the BBC reported, the estimated median age in Sub-Saharan Africa is under the age of 19. Andrews Atta-Samoa, a senior researcher for the Institute of Security Studies in South Africa, believes that, in his own words, it is therefore important that in seeking to harness Africa's demographic dividend, the right leadership and prudent policies are prioritized. Prudent policies is the key phrase. The vast leagues of young Africans care about the environment, but they need to eat and work and learn even more. Why would young Africans be persuaded to forego what the older people of the industrialized nations take for granted? Without a prudent approach to decarbonization, young Africans will not trust the industrialized world to act in its interests. Prudent policies in the African context refers to policies of development that capitalizes on the youth dividend. In his book, Africa's Moment, Jean-Michel Severino, former head of France's International Development Agency, AFD, discussed the topic extensively, and he summarized his views in an interview with the BBC last year in exemplary fashion. I quote, "The decline of fertility rates following a period of rapid growth presents huge economic opportunities and has started to launch Africa on a very long-term growth pattern. The higher density of the population allows domestic markets to be created, demand to emerge, and local firms to develop in an economic environment that is more business-friendly than 20 or 30 years ago. The relative cost of infrastructure declines. The proportion of the population living in cities also increases with all the productivity gains this carries." That sounds like good news for most. He goes on to state that urbanization is one of the most powerful growth engines the world has ever experienced. Quote, "Of course, the impressive economic growth rates the continent has enjoyed since the turn of the century are still insufficient to really catch up with high-income countries. Of course, economic growth in Africa remains linked to the price of commodities," he said. That said, many landlocked countries with few natural resources have enjoyed fast growth in the past decade, and commodity prices do not entirely explain the surge of domestic firms that one now sees blossoming across the continent. Telecom services and improved education have also played an important role in boosting the productivity of the economy. Of course, this will have an end, Mr. Severino says. There will come a time, which Europe and Japan are experiencing now, and so too will China, when a smaller and smaller proportion of working-age adults have more and more elderly dependents to support. The point that Dr. Severino makes is that Africa is becoming the author of its own growth, driven by its demography dividend. This growth requires infrastructure on a vast scale because its urbanization has but begun. And urbanization requires infrastructure, water, and energy. What does that mean? The African Development Bank reported in 2012 that Africa experienced the highest urban growth in the developing world during the previous 2 decades and expect this growth of 3.5% to continue into 2050. Consider that. Keep in mind also that there are now nearly 1 billion Africans and that some people expect there to be 2 billion people on the continent by 2050. While urbanization is growing at pace in both developed and developing countries, more than 90% of future population growth, says the AFDB, will be accounted for by the large cities in the developing countries. Projections indicate that between 2010 and 2025, some African cities will account for up to 85% of the population. According to the AFDB in 2010, the share of the African urban population was about 36%, and it is projected to increase to 50% and 60% by 2030 and 2050, respectively. Urbanization in Africa is a mixed blessing, however, because despite the economic growth so far, cities on the continent are still challenged by the proliferation of slums, urban poverty, and rising inequality. Inequality in African cities remains the second highest in the world, with an average Gini coefficient of about 0.58, well above the average of 0.4. Rural-urban migration and natural population growth rates in cities are the major causes of the increasing rate of urban growth and slum proliferation in Africa. How would one gain support for decarbonisation amongst the growing population of young African poor who live in appalling conditions, struggling to feed themselves? Appalling conditions is not simply a phrase or a trifle when considering that an analysis of demographic and health surveys suggests that a mere 25% of Africa's urban population has access to toilets connected to sewers. The WHO UNICEF 2000 assessment statistics for sanitation for 43 of Africa's largest cities showed that 19% of the population remains unserved. Consider statistics on the proportion of households with sewer connections in the largest city in each African nation. In most of these cities, less than 10% of the population has sewer connections, while in many, including Abidjan, Addis Ababa, Asmara, Brazil, Cotonou, Kinshasa, Libreville, Moroni, N'Djamena, Ouagadougou, less than 2% have connections. Some would also argue that water is a bigger problem for Africa than its carbon footprint. By the 1990s, among 67 urban centres in 29 African nations, including most of the continent's largest cities, 58% were using rivers at least 25 kilometres away. And just over half of the urban centres that relied on rivers depended on interbasin transfers. Imagine the consequences. Think also about reports that about 85% of water withdrawals in Africa are for agriculture, and that in some mountainous regions of East Africa, women spend up to 27% of their caloric intake in collecting water. I read somewhere that it has been calculated that in South Africa alone, women collectively walk the equivalent distance of 16 times to the moon and back per day, gathering water for their families. I have no idea if this is accurate, but allow me to use the anecdote to illustrate the problem of persuading Africans to trust the rest of the world on climate change policy that might affect development and economic growth on their continent given their current state of development. Many Africans would agree with Oxfam climate policy head Tim Gore when he states that rich high emitters should be held accountable for their emissions no matter where they live. Yet, as Oxfam explains eloquently, disputes over how to share responsibility for curbing greenhouse gas emissions and aiding climate vulnerable countries are among the thorniest and longest running issues in the 25-year-old UN climate process. Rich and developing nations remain deeply divided on the issue of differentiation, how to share out responsibility for curbing greenhouse gas emissions, which derive mainly from burning coal, oil and gas. Trust is the nub of the problem. Perhaps in Africa, efforts to ensure a better future for the continent of the young should be harnessed to the decarbonisation horse, if you want success. Thank you for allowing me to contribute to your discussions. I hope that this humble contribution will make even a small positive difference in determining policy for a better, more hopeful future.